Welcome to class 3 of the Appliqué and Ruching class that we're doing in the AQS Let's Quilt Beginner Series with Bonnie. And today we're going to be working on leaves. So let's start out. To make leaves, the first thing we're going to need is some fabric that kind of looks like leaves. Now I'm going to back up just a little bit because part of the decision that you make on your leaves may have to do with the fabric that you chose, particularly for the 1/2-inch wide stems. And so I chose this one, and you can see it's got blues and teals and greens, little bits of tan in it. And so I could use quite a few different colors of leaves with that, couldn't I? All right, you also could use one like this that has more browns and golds in it, or one that is really more just different greens. So those are our choices. Of course, you know, some of you may want to just do your stems in a plain green, and that's perfectly all right too. You know what? One of the things about quilting is there aren't any rules, or if there are, they're meant to be broken because this is your project. So let's move on to the fabric that we might want to use for our leaves. Now I've laid out, and I just went to my stash and just pulled out a bunch of fabrics that I thought could be used for leaves. And you can see that I've used a variety of greens, some browns and tans, even some purplish colors. Then we go into the blue greens and the blues. So we can use any color of fabric that we want as we make our last roses of summer quilt. You know, the reason I put so many like browns and teals and different colors in my quilt was because at the end of summer the leaves do change color, don't they? So that's what I was thinking about. So now I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the other tools that we're going to be using today. We're going to be using a variety of pencils. We have the Frixion pens that can be removed with heat, the air soluble, the water soluble, the white lead, black lead that's in the Soline pencil, just a plain Soline pencil. We're going to be using a little bit of glue, and mostly because you can really target this, but this is the Soline glue stick. And a lot of these notions are available from our sponsor, 9-Patch Fabrics. But sometimes we might want a wide swath of glue, and this is a little harder to target, but this really is just a washable Elmer's glue. If you're going to use Elmer's on your fabric, you want to make sure it is the washable kind. Sometimes they'll call it school washable glue. That works. And you also can use the Roxanne's Basted glue that has a tip, and I haven't opened this yet, but this is, and that's why I've kept it in the plastic bag. It's real easy for the tip to get clogged sometimes, so I'm keeping it in there until I'm ready to use that on my quilt. Now, because we're going to be doing some handwork today, we're going to be using some needles. So your needles are a personal preference. A lot of times I use a 10 between, and this is a John James 10 between. I find that I don't bend them as quickly as I do some other brands. And this one is a milliner's needle, and it's a little bit longer. I'm going to be using that today because we're going to be doing some applique, but we're also going to be doing some basting and running stitches, and so that lets you put more stitches on the needle. And we'll be using some silk thread for our applique. And I noticed that there was a real interesting dialogue on Facebook recently about these little tiny strawberries. It's filled with either silicone or sand, and if you ever get a burr like on the end of your needle, you just stick it in here and it'll help sharpen that right off of there. Now I'm using it today because I've threaded 4 needles at once, and I needed a place to keep them. And so this is an easy way to keep those secure until I'm ready to pull one of those needles off. I don't know about you, but these old eyes need a needle threader. And so this is a clover needle threader, and it works really, really well. You're going to want some paper scissors. You're going to want some fabric scissors. We're going to be using a little bit of spray starch. I'll show you how we do that in a minute. And we're going to be using a little bit of sew-in interfacing. And so this is just a lightweight sew-in interfacing. All right, then I have one more tool that often isn't a tool that you'll find in your sewing room. My room has lots of craft items, and so this is just a paintbrush. It can be a flat edge. This one happens to be a small stencil brush. But we're going to be using that with that starch in a few minutes. Now, I've talked about a lot of these products already. We have quite a few sponsors for this program, and we're going to take just a short break and have a word from 2 sponsors. And when we come back, I'm going to show you 5 different ways that you can do your leaves.
Tracy's Tables has all of your custom sewing table needs. Visit tracystables.com to see the complete line of unique tables, carts, and shelves. And all of Tracy's tables are made in the USA.
The secret to every great project is great lighting. You can have beautiful fabric, the best threads, but if you can't see what you are sewing, we all know what will happen. Vivilux lights and lasers are the only lights made by quilters for quilters. Look for Vivilux lights and lasers at your favorite independent sewing and quilt shop or online.
All right, so now we're ready to make some leaves, and there are a variety of ways that we can do this. First thing that I did was I just took my pattern and drew several different leaves on a piece of paper. And I usually do them in groups of 3, mostly because I think things look better if you have odd numbers than they do if you have even numbers. And so I probably would make like 3 of the same color. All right, and so there was my template. All right, so then I took freezer paper and adhered several layers of freezer paper. Now, I often will either use 2 layers or I'll use 3 layers. I know that some people even say that they use 4 layers to make their templates using freezer paper. But all I did was iron the freezer paper layers together after I traced them onto a piece of freezer paper. So this is just a piece of printer paper that I did the template on to begin with because I'm using it several different ways. But then I would have traced it on the top layer of freezer paper, ironed them together, and so then now I'm ready to cut. And I'm just going to show you a little trick on cutting. Let's just cut one off of here so that I can just deal with one. One of the things about cutting is you want to feed the paper into your scissors. So I'm really just pretty much holding my scissors pretty steady and rolling that paper right into the blades of my scissors. And just putting a little pressure on my scissors as I trim that off. Now, here's something that you just need to know, and that is sometimes you'll end up with a little burr or a little bump, and I've got one right there. And so this is an emery board that I keep in my desk, and you can see that I've actually just about worn off the top and the bottom edges. But for this, I just need the center. So I'm just going to roll that right over, just like you were filing a nail, right over that edge. And that's all it took to take that little bump out, is to just run that emery board right over the edge of it. And the reason that's important is because we're going to roll our fabric over the edge of this. And if you've got a little notch out there, it's probably going to show when you roll the fabric over the top of it. All right, so once we get that done, then the easiest thing to do, and isn't that a pretty leaf? I just kind of isolated, it looks like a vein right down the middle. I pressed it to the back side. Okay, so I either can do this and then fold the template, the fabric over the template, or I can use that template to draw on top of the fabric like I've done here. So all I did there was I just laid the template on the top of the fabric, traced around it, marked it with a white pencil, and now this one is all ready for me to do needle turn applique. All right, so that's method number 1. And so you can see I've made a lot of different colored leaves. Here's another leaf that turned out really, it would be a real pretty leaf. Okay, so then the next method that I'm going to show you is to take that same template, and here you can see that I have made a whole sheet of leaves, and I'm going to laminate this with self-adhesive laminating sheets. And I just bought these peel and stick. I ordered them from Amazon, but they're really, really easy to use. Let me just move this out of my way so I have a little bit of working room here. I'm going to show you how easy this is to do. There's a top lip on the paper that you're going to pull off. And it's going to stick, so you have to be real careful, and you need to make sure you're ready to go when you put it on your paper. So I'm going to pull this down just partly. Let's get the edge of my paper up here, because once it goes down, it will be stuck. So I'm going to line it up here with the top edge of my paper. And so now you're just going to pull that lining Oh, and you see I got a few wrinkles in there. I probably messed that up a little bit. I think I won't go ahead and put the backing on it yet, but you want to be real careful. You can see I still got quite a few of these leaves I can use, but I've messed up right down the middle 3 or 4 of those. So I'll go ahead and do the backing too so that you can see. Maybe I can do it better the second time. I can line it up better than I did last time. Guess I just did it in too big a hurry the last time, because if I just pull a little bit, all right, so now all I have to do is come back and do exactly the same thing that I did just a little bit ago, and you'll find that this is a little easier really in some ways to cut. And so again, I'm going to feed that right into my scissors. And again, I can tell that I have a little bit of a burr right there where I ended. So rather than try to take my scissors and fix that, there we go. I just did it with my file and it's all nice and smooth. So now this one could be, if I were going to draw on top like I did here for the needle turn, I could use this also. Or you wouldn't want to iron this because that's going to melt the plastic. But let's go to the next method here and I'll show you how it won't melt the plastic. And that is if we use heat-resistant template plastic. And you can always tell this one's a little bit different because it's it kind of looks like a cloud, so it's kind of cloudy. So if you ever get your papers mixed up or your plastic mixed up, this one's going to be the one that will be the heat-resistant. So I've done that here for you. And you can see it was hard to stick a pin through too, to pin it on here. But now I put this on the back of my fabric with just a little bit of a dot of glue stick. So let's see if I've got Here, we'll just peel this off of here. I'll show you how I did that. Is I just put a dot of glue in the middle. And now I can lay that on the back of my fabric. And that's all ready now for me, is it'll dry a little bit, but it'll be real easy to get this template plastic off of the back of your leaf when you're ready to use it. Okay, so one more method, and that is the interfacing. And here you can see that I have drawn the leaf shape on the interfacing and then just laid it together. I stitched around on that line, and when you do that, now you can cut a small slit in the back. You can see I just took my scissors and cut a small slit and turn it right side out. Now I will tell you that if you're going to use this method, you want to make sure when you get down to your point, you turn and take one stitch sideways across that point. It'll just make this turn and turn out better when you've turned it. Okay? So those are all the different ways that we can make our leaves. So we're going to take a short word from our sponsors, and when we come back, I'm going to show you one more technique to finish the edges of these leaves and how we put them on our quilt block.
Nine Patch Fabrics has a wide variety of fabric, patterns, and notions. We offer quilt store quality fabric from manufacturers such as Moda, Robert Kaufman, Island Batik, and more. Nine Patch Fabrics also features a variety of notions, including creative grids, rulers, sew line marking tools, and more. Visit Nine Patch Fabrics at ninepatchfabrics.com.
All right, so now we've determined how we're going to make our leaves. And to be honest, to press over the edges, I prefer the ones that are made out of the 3 layers of freezer paper. And I've already done a few of those here, but I'm going to show you how I do it. I've already taken, I sprayed a little bit of spray starch, and it's going to bubble up on you. And so you just want to let that kind of settle down. And here's my paintbrush. And I work on a piece of paper towel just because I don't want to get this all over my ironing surface, and you wouldn't want it on your ironing board either, I don't think, because you're painting this on the edges. So I'm just going to paint it around on the edges. And now I'm going to bring it over to my ironing surface, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that tip and I'm going to fold it right straight down. Now, the one thing you don't want to do is don't cut this tip too short, because you'll see that it's a whole lot easier if you can go like that and then fold that first edge in. And now I can set that down here and kind of hold that with my thumb until I get my iron down there to press it. And again, we're just going to let the heat of the iron do the work. Now I find that I like to do it from this angle so that I can take the tip of the iron and press it right over the edge of that freezer paper template. And just keep turning it around. Let the iron sit there for a minute and do its work. Now I find sometimes when you get down to this part that you want to pick it up and get that first edge turned in, because the iron doesn't want to do that very much. It wants to crease that a little bit right there for you. Because that starch is still wet, it will turn it over, and now I'm here at this end, and now I'm just going to take my nail and I'm going to turn that edge over. And let's just set the iron there and let it do its work. And so you can see I have those edges turned over, And you want to let this, before you pop that out of there, you want to let that cool good. And so I'm going to do one more. Again, the first thing I'm going to do is turn that tip over and fold that first side in. I'm just going to kind of hold that with my fingernail till I can get the tip of the iron on it. I can hear it sizzling. This is one of those tasks in preparation for your applique that you can do all of this in a sitting or two, and then when you're ready to sit down and applique, you can just applique away. Now I will have to tell you, I'm showing you this method. This is kind of like my alternative method. Most of the time I do needle turn. And I'm going to show you how to do that next. Okay, so do you see you get a nice sharp point on your leaf, nice rounded edges. And so the multiple layers of freezer paper really do make it a whole lot easier to use this method. All right, so these are cooled down, and so I can just come back here and pop out that template, and you can see the edges are all turned under for me. Let's do another one here. This one I used the Mylar. And I will tell you one thing about the Mylar, and that is it stays warmer longer for you if you're touching it with your fingers. And so the Mylar works just fine. Here's another one that I used, the freezer paper. Do you see how that just pulls loose? And that's just the wax releasing from the back of your fabric. All right, so let me move this out of the way, because the next thing we need to do is figure out, oh, I didn't say anything, but you know what? I like a lot of light, and I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the light that we use around us as we're doing our stitching. And this is the Vivilux rechargeable light, and so it doesn't have to be plugged in, but it's rechargeable, so all you got to do is plug it in every once in a while and recharge it. All right, I've laid out my block, and you can see since we were here from the last lesson, I have added the 1/2 inch stem all the way around. And I'll tell you, I did it 2 different ways. I did 2 of the stems where I pinned them in place, and of course they would have been laying open like this. Would have been laying open. I pinned them in place and sewed them. I took them and only had enough pins to do 2 of them at the time, which is probably good, because what I learned when I did the other 2 right at the sewing machine is I only pinned the corner right here where the joint is, and I just took the rest of it and laid it in there and just stitched very slowly, and I didn't have to use any pins except that one to get it started. And then and so now I will need to applique this down. All right, before we start appliquing, I'm going to show you how I mark the locations of my leaves. Now there are 2 different ways that you can do this. I used my template, my vinyl template, to do it. And so like right here where I have a leaf, I just took the template and bent it back so that I laid the half of the template over, and I just drew me a line. And all I have for lines on my background are just a placement line to show me what angle that I want to put that leaf. And the round part goes toward the stem and the point goes outward, so that you have absolutely no marks, even if you do mark the placement of your leaves. Now, the other way that you could do this, my background is a little bit dark, so I couldn't just lay it on my paper pattern. But if you're using white or a very light color for your background, you could lay it right over your pattern and do exactly the same thing. So this way I pinned it on to my background and marked the leaves. I just picked it up so that I could just mark those lines. So either way, now we're ready to start adding our leaves. I told you I had threaded some needles already. So I'm just going to take needle number 1, and I never take more thread than from my hand to my elbow. Okay, so I'm going to show you the applique stitch that I use, and it's one that hides very well. But before I do that, I cut my thread so that it just went to my elbow. I'm sewing with 100 weight silk thread from YLI, and it's very, very thin. But some of you may not know how to do the quilter's knot, and we haven't done any hand stitching yet on these programs. So I'm going to show you. I'm going to lay that tail on my needle. Now I'm going to, because this is so thin, I'm going to wrap it about 5 times. If I were using like 50 weight thread, I wouldn't wrap it more than 3 times. But now I'm going to grab where those wraps are, and I'm going to push that needle through, and I'm just going to hang on to the thread until I get to the very end. And so now I have this beautiful little knot right there. And I'm going to trim off the tail end of this here so that we get rid of the extra. I'm going to pick up my work here, and I'm going to slide my needle underneath the edge of the piece I'm going to be appliquing on. So that knot will be on the back side. Okay, now the applique stitch is really pretty simple. Here's where my thread came up. So I'm going to slide my needle underneath the lip of the piece I'm appliquing down, and I'm going to bring it up right in that fold. I'm going to take it down underneath the lip, and bring it right up in the fold. Now, I know that sometimes I'll hear people say they're doing applique and their stitches are 1/4 of an inch apart. Your stitches for your applique should be the same amount of stitches as if you were sewing it on the sewing machine. So if you're sewing 10 to 12 stitches per inch on your machine, that's what you need to be doing when you're appliquing. So, okay, so here's where my thread came up. That's where I'm going to put my needle underneath the edge, and I'm going to come up, and you're just going to take really a teeny tiny little stitch. Sometimes with this, I'm using gray thread for this, but I can tell you that I've even done this demonstration where I used a red thread on a piece of white fabric. And by sliding that underneath the lip like I'm doing, what you're doing is when I pull the thread, it's pulling it under. So let's do it again. Under the lip, up in the fold. under the lip and up in the fold. So that's all it is. You just keep doing that same stitch. And I'm going to turn my work over here so that you can see the stitches that I did when I sewed the second side of these small stems down. It looks like a row of machine stitching. So that's one of the things that you have to remember, is that this stitching right here was done by machine. This stitching right here was done with this applique technique. So all right, we're going to take a short word from our sponsors and we'll be right back. And I'm going to sew a couple leaves on for you, one by hand and one by machine.
Whether you're doing applique by hand or by machine, couching or ruching, YLI has the products to support your creativity. For needle turn applique, choose YLI Silk 100. It's so fine it just disappears into the fabric, and nothing feels like silk. Ask your local independent quilt shop or check out our website at ylicorp.com.
I'm Amanda Murphy, and I'm a quilt and pattern designer. The Bernina Q16 is quilting magic. One of the hallmarks of a great quilting experience is when you lose yourself in your work.
Bernina, made to create.
Okay, so I actually just worked myself up here to where I have a leaf that needs to be sewn on so that I can show you how I applique one of these leaves right here. Now, one of the things that you can do, you can put a pin in that, but I also could come back here and just put some glue right down that stripe. And this is if you wanted to get this all ready and wanted to take it with you on a trip or something. You could have this part of it all done, and none of the glue that I put down the middle will get on the outside edges, where if I need to adjust that turn under a little bit, I can still do that with my needle. I'm going to take my needle under so I can come up over here under the edge of my leaf. And we're going to do exactly that same stitch that we were doing just a minute ago. And you see here how that wants to be a little unruly right there? I'm using my thumb to help hold those seam allowances under. And again, I'm going to go down and I'm going to come up right in the edge of that leaf. Again, I'm going to go down, come up right in the edge of that leaf. And do you see how I'm using my thumb to hold those seam allowances in place? And I'll come up here and just get that next little bit all settled. Now I will caution you, do you see how I just pulled that out because I pulled my thread a little bit tight? I can tell you that sometimes I pull my tension just a little bit too much. If that ever happens and you get your quilt all done, or your quilt top all done, and you see some little ripples around the edges of your applique, I find that I have to go and turn it over on the back side and slice it open. If you do that, it will release that tension and it'll lay perfectly flat for you. So that's exactly like I just did on the stem, but now I want to do one for you that is totally needle turn. Get me another needle with some thread in it here. So again, I'm going to do my knot. I'm going to twist it around about 5 times. Hold those twists, pull the knot through. And there's our knot. All right, so now I'm going to do exactly the same thing as I just did a minute ago, in that I'm going to position the leaf. And let's put this one right here. And I have nothing. And again, I could use a little bit of glue stick just to hold it right down the center. Then you don't have to try to stick pins in there. I just find pins are a nuisance sometimes when you're trying to applique. That little bit of glue right down the middle. All right, now I always try to start on a sort of flat edge when I'm doing these leaves. And the needle turn method is really just taking the tip of your needle and turning under that edge. All right, and so I need to get my knot buried underneath here, so I'm going to do that and come up in that edge. I will tell you, this is a piece of batik, and you will find that stitching with batik with a hand needle is a little bit different than stitching on regular cotton. Oh, do you know, I wanted to talk about thimbles. And I have a whole handful of thimbles here. And you know what? I use some of them at different times. This is just a regular metal thimble, and I wear it on my middle finger so that I can push with that finger. This is a Roxanne, which if you have long nails, your nails will stick out over the top. And what I really like this one for is if you have to push sideways especially, it's real thick right there. Now this is a leather thimble, and there's a metal piece on the inside of this thimble right now, right there. And I can tell you that I have actually, when I was hand quilting a whole quilt, drilled the needle backwards right through this thimble. So I don't use this one very often. This is a different kind of leather thimble. Again, if you push really hard, you very well may push that needle right through that leather. This is just an inexpensive plastic thimble, the kind people give away, that works just fine. But my new favorite one is this one, and this is a clover needle. Mine is the size medium, and there's a hole on the card when you buy it so that you can stick your finger through it to see which size you need. But I like it because this rubber stuff on the top kind of adheres to your finger. And if you haven't worn a thimble at all or done very much hand sewing where you needed to wear a thimble, I would suggest that you put it on and wear it around the kitchen a little bit to get used to it, and make sure that you can keep it on your finger. You might find that you want to have a different style thimble. Okay, so back to my needle turn. Okay, so I'm just going to continue, and I'm going to take the needle and just turn that fabric right under along the edge. And again, I'm sliding the needle underneath, coming up in the fold. I want to get up here to the tip so I can show you, because the rest of it's just going to be done exactly the same way as what we've already done. You see how I just took the tip of that needle and just pulled that right underneath there? All right, so I'm right at the very tip now of my leaf. So I'm going to turn this just a little bit so that I can get at it from another angle, because right there at that point, I'm going to take one more stitch just right straight down and come up in the tip. And now I'm ready to sweep again, and I'm going to take that, whoops, did you see how I did that? Let me do it again. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to just catch that fabric, and I'm just going to take a sweep Well, now I probably won't do it nearly as well as I did it the first time. Sweep that right down underneath and get the next little part already in position. Now it looks like I got a little bobble here on my tip. And you know what? Leaves are never made identical, and that's one of the beauties of applique. But you can see how just taking your needle and sweeping the edge, and that's why I draw the pattern on top when I do the needle turn. There are people who will tell you that they put a piece of freezer paper on the bottom and then turn it over the edge of that. I sort of like to have the line so I know exactly where I need to turn. All right, now I want to show you something here on my quilt, because when I was working on this, it was for my Anybody Can Learn to Quilt book. And I'd been doing quite a bit of traveling. So when I traveled, I could work on it by hand. Well, then when I got home, it had to be finished, so I did part of it by the sewing machine. So I would challenge anybody really to be able to look at this quilt, unless you were right on top of it, to know the difference. These two blocks were done with the leaves all done by hand. These two blocks, alternate, were done on the sewing machine. It really doesn't make any difference. Either way that you prefer is perfectly all right. But sometimes I match the thread. Sometimes I made the thread a little bit different. I did a few different stitches. And so now I'm going to go to the sewing machine so I can show you how we do that. All right, so now I'm going to do some things with my machine here, and I've already done some samples that I want to show you. And so I did, the first one is just a regular zigzag, and I did it 0.75 by 1.5, so it was twice as wide as it was in the length. And then I decided I'd change that, so I did it 1 and 2, and man, I really like that. And then I decided that I would go look at a stitch that's kind of like a feather stitch. You know, leaves would sometimes have little barbs that come off of them. And so I thought, okay, so that would be fun. Well, so the first one that I did here, you can see I didn't get the needle off the edge of my fabric very well, but it was 7.9 by 3.2. So it was about half. And then I changed it so that I changed it because I wanted it so it didn't fly off, that these side angles were not quite so wide. So I changed it so it was 3 and 2.5. And that really does look nice. So I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to show you, I'm going to sew a leaf on, and we'll do it with the zigzag. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about how I have the machine set up. First of all, this is the Bernina 770, which is the Quilter's edition. It's got some great features specifically for us quilters. And so I've got the needle down. I'm using 50 weight YLI thread in both the top and the bottom. And I have on a foot so that it's open the whole time so that I can see exactly where my needle is going. The other thing that this does, you saw when I stopped there that the presser foot raised up a little bit. That's really great when you're doing machine applique, because if you need to make a little of adjustment or you need to move, you don't have to use your hand to lift that presser foot. It automatically does it for you. So now see, if I stop, now I can adjust my fabric. Now when I get down here to the very point, I want to make sure that this zigzag is on the outside of my piece, so that I can turn the fabric. One more stitch, come on. Now I can turn. I'm going to take one tiny little stitch across that tip. One more. And now I can turn and go back down the other side. You can see anytime you need to make an adjustment of this fabric, this presser foot is wonderful. The other thing that I probably should have done on this was just slow my machine down just a tad. Now I can see that I need to make just a slight little adjustment right here. You can see how I can just make minute little changes in twisting this around to get my fabric right where I want it. Okay, so now we have that all stitched on. Just a narrow little zigzag right here along the edge. It looks like I could have gotten my point just a tiny bit better. But now, I didn't do it on this quilt, but I have been since I made that quilt. When I do applique, I usually put some kind of a quilting line that becomes a stem or something down the middle of it. And the reason we would want to do that is that if the edge would happen to come loose, you still have another thread that's going to hold that piece on there. So, takes 40 leaves in one block, and for the next class I'm going to show you some flowers that I made in yellow and orange and pink and some more red ones. One of the things that you get from taking this class is Bernina of America is a sponsor of this program, and I am a Bernina brand ambassador. And so that means that I can offer you a $100 rebate that comes from Bernina, not your dealer, it comes from Bernina, if you decide that you're going to buy a Bernina sewing machine within 30 days of the end of this class. In the description of this class, you will find a link that will let you email me. You'll have to request the coupon to be able to do that. And after you've purchased your machine, you'll need to document where you bought it, the date you bought it. It will have the date of this program on it so that they can make sure that it was within 30 days. And I will mail you a coupon from Bernina, and you'll need to complete that coupon and mail it directly to Bernina. It had nothing to do with your dealer. This is all a special reward from Bernina. And you'll get a $100 rebate back on your purchase. Now, before you go, don't forget to go register for the giveaway. We've got some great prizes from all of these wonderful sponsors that we have for this show. And if you're not yet an AQS member, we're busy working on our shows for next year. So join and you'll not only get the American Quilter magazine 6 times a year, but you'll also get a discount on classes, workshops, and any of the other items that AQS sells. So we'll see you next time. Be ready to work on ruched flowers.